Why you can stop worrying. Yellowstone's supervolcano is about to end the world. While a potential eruption of the supervolcano that lies beneath this iconic park may garner more alarming headlines, the more likely hazard is a major earthquake. Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. You can't miss the heat coming from beneath the surface here. It's visible everywhere you look, from the steaming geysers to the bubbling mud puddles and the colorful hot springs. All that activity is fueled by a smoldering supervolcano, a heat engine buried deep underground that has produced some of the largest eruptions in the world. The last supereruption about 631,000 years ago spewed 240 cubic miles of pulverized rock and ash into the atmosphere, covering nearly half the country in the powdery residue. It's an active volcano. It will erupt again, said Michael Poland, scientist in charge at the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, a consortium of 8 organizations led by the U.S. Geological Survey. But don't go changing your vacation plans just yet, or potentially ever. Scientists who study Yellowstone's 45 by 30 mile caldera, roughly the size of Rhode Island, say the underground system probably will give decades of warning before it blows, and that isn't likely to happen for thousands of years. Despite the seismic orchestra of snap, crackle and pop that goes on underground, there are no signs it's about to become more explosive. Geological events are stunning in their power, but they're infrequent in human terms, said Jerry Fairley, a professor of geological sciences at the University of Idaho who has studied Yellowstone's supervolcano for the past 9 years. We live on a very active planet, but it's rare that we get to see the kind of power from the Earth that it is capable of generating. Old Faithful erupts on August 4, 2018 in Yellowstone National Park. The geyser puts on its show about every 90 minutes. It's the story that never dies. That long view has been partially drowned out in the past decade by a fever pitch of documentaries, online articles and amateur video clips that point to Yellowstone's frequent minor earthquakes. It averages 1,500 to 2,500 a year, or blatantly false rumors that the ground is swelling upward as signs the volcano's time bomb is ticking down. The result, the most extreme of these conspiracy theories say, would be the end of the world. Such warnings draw conclusions from the volcano's past eruptions to model what it could spew next, a faulty connecting of dots that ignores key information on how volcanoes operate, experts say. Yet those theories have continued to pop up over the past decade on social media services and often are revived when a new study emerges or a swarm of earthquakes hits the park. The Park Service fields calls every year from would-be vacationers who want to know if visiting the national park, which receives more than 4 million people a year, would put them in danger. We see people who are thinking about changing their plans because of the stuff they're reading, said Neil Herbert, a spokesman for the park. It's the story that never dies. The signs just aren't there. Visitors to the park come for the unusual geological activity. They bustle through the heavy summer crowds to feel the steam coming off the geysers and see the brilliant colors of the hot springs, shades of burnt orange, bright blue and vivid green, created by the microorganisms that thrive in the extreme heat. Regular earthquakes are usually too subtle, at magnitude 2 or far less, to jolt them. Those rumblings are one of the giveaways a giant volcano slumbers below the surface. But the quakes don't indicate a big eruption is coming soon. In fact, the frequent earthquakes may be acting as a safety valve to release pressure before it builds up, similar to how a pressure cooker releases steam so it remains safe. They may be a sign of safety rather than a sign of impending doom, Fairley said. Any warning signs would occur well before an eruption, and they just aren't there right now. Multiple, larger earthquakes would rattle the park, the ground would move up or down by tens of feet over months or years as the magma underneath shuffled around, gases would be emitted from the ground, the chemicals in the springs would change, and more heat would be generated, Poland said. It's simply business as usual for the park right now, Fairley said. Yellowstone, in a sense, is breathing, he said. When the volcano does erupt, it's likely to be on a smaller scale that would more closely resemble Hawaii's Kilauea volcano eruption this summer, which caused a lava flow that forced evacuations and submerged neighborhoods but didn't result in the cataclysmic destruction of Yellowstone's past supereruptions. The last time Yellowstone experienced a lava flow was about 70,000 years ago. What's more, we'd probably have decades of warning between the first sign of an eruption and Yellowstone actually blowing its top, said Christy Till, a geologist and assistant professor at Arizona State University who has researched the volcano for the past 6 years. That's the kind of timescale where we think something could happen to trigger an eruption, she said. It's not like it would happen tomorrow. The magma underneath Yellowstone would also need to be heated up a lot. Right now seismic studies indicate it's mostly solidified, not the hot liquid required for an eruption. You would need to collect a huge volume of magma all in the same place, and then you'd need to generate enough pressure to get it moving up to the surface, Poland said. And we see neither of those conditions in place right now. It's entirely possible those conditions may never exist again, the supervolcano may be dying, said Elliot Bindeman, a University of Oregon geology professor who has been working on Yellowstone's caldera for 20 years. Each supereruption melts part of the crust, hardening it and making it more difficult to generate enough heat to remelt the material. After a certain point, you remelt the entire crust and now it's sturdier, Bindeman said. The melting temperature rises and the heat below can't break through the tough outer skin formed by previous eruptions. Essentially, it just cannot get hot enough to erupt again, he said. What would a supereruption at Yellowstone look like? If the worst-case scenario did happen, it wouldn't be a pretty day, for decades, in the USA. The eruption of Mount St. Helens would be a small firecracker compared to one of the major caldera eruptions of Yellowstone, Fairley said. Millions of people would die in the immediate explosion and in its aftereffects, Fairley predicted. Ash would fall over much of the country, grinding air traffic to a halt. Water would be contaminated, livestock would die, crops would fail and the country's heartland would be unfarmable for years. The climate would change because ash would filter out the sun's powerful rays, and it would be several years or even decades before it could bounce back. During Yellowstone's supereruption about 631,000 years ago, ash covered North Dakota through most of Texas and from southern California through most of Missouri and Arkansas. But a massive eruption at Yellowstone, or another from one of the other dozen or so supervolcanoes in the world, would still not be the mass extinction level event some fear. Humanity would survive, but it would not be a fun time, Poland said. Humanity has actually done just that. We were around for 2 such eruptions in the past 100,000 years, both even larger than the last big one at Yellowstone. And we're obviously still here now. I'm not saying it would be easy, but there's some evidence to suggest that our cave people ancestors did okay, Poland said.